Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more Conversations. Drowned in the sea of media coverage of the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, we've heard very little of Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 election. But last we checked, Mueller is alive and well. Why is Donald Trump so afraid of Mueller? Why does he continually seek to undermine his work in a drumroll of hysterical tweets? Mueller has answered Trump in court with a hailstorm of indictments or guilty pleas that have named 32 individuals and 3 companies, but none of the charges have explicitly alleged collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign. These matters may be reserved for a later time. Many of the factual details that Mueller has scrutinized have been discussed in the press, but obviously there is more to come, and the more to come has cast a cloud on Trump's presidency. Here to tell us more is investigative reporter and author Garrett Graff. Garrett Graff has been an editor of Politico magazine and The Washingtonian. He has taught journalism at Georgetown. Garrett looked into the allegations of collusion swimming around Donald Trump in an article in Wired intriguingly entitled, "What Robert Mueller Knows and 9 Areas He'll Pursue Next." It's my pleasure to welcome Garrett Graff to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Jim.
Now, Garrett, what's happened to Robert Mueller? He's been deafeningly silent in recent days.
Well, I think one of the things that's been so fascinating about this investigation, and I've covered it for almost 2 years now. I mean, back when it was just the pre-election probe into Russia's unfolding attack on the election, Mueller at every stage of this has been 4 to 6 months ahead of where we thought he was. Remember, the first that we heard about Michael Cohen being involved in this investigation at all was in April, when Mueller referred the campaign finance charges around the Stormy Daniels matter to the Southern District of New York prosecutors here in Manhattan. Well, Mueller had been actually investigating that and had been doing interviews about that last November. And sort of at every stage of this, Mueller has been much further along than we thought he was.
So where do you think he stands right now?
Well, what I think he's done is, in his first sets of indictments, he's laid out what I call the 4 corners of this investigation, which is money laundering and past business deals. That's sort of the part of this investigation that has to do with Paul Manafort and Rick Gates. Second is this bucket of charges related to the Russian Twitter bots and Facebook trolls of the Internet Research Agency, sort of what we would call the Russian information influence operations targeting the campaign.
That's the propaganda aspect.
Exactly. And then the third corner of this investigation is the indictment that we saw Mueller bring against the Russian military intelligence, the GRU, the officers engaged in the active cyber penetrations of John Podesta, the DNC, the DCCC, and the probing of the state-level election voting systems. And then the fourth corner of this investigation is what I would call, and this is sort of not the technical lawyer speak that your colleagues would know, but I call it the sketchy Russian campaign contacts. And that's everything that transpired during the campaign and then during the transition. So that's everything from George Papadopoulos and his campaign level contacts to Michael Flynn's conversations with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak during the transition. And so if you sort of think of this investigation as those 4 corners, what I think we're going to see Mueller do in the weeks and months ahead is fill in the picture in between. Draw the connections between these different efforts, and really sort of help us understand how all of these different efforts that targeted and were part of the campaign and the transition influenced one another and changed the course of American history.
Now, emerging from all this have been 2 key indictments, really. One was the propaganda indictment against the Internet Research Agency. And the second was the one against the 22 Russian officers who he claimed were involved in the hack the hacking of the DNC. Now, does Mueller claim there was any domestic involvement?
They do establish that this was a government-led nation-state assault on the 2016 election. That the Kremlin, with the approval, presumably according to U.S. intelligence sources, of Vladimir Putin himself, was involved in targeting this election on two fronts, both to harm Hillary Clinton, and then as the campaign advanced, the goals of the Russian operation changed and evolved to include actively helping aid Donald Trump's candidacy. So we know absolutely that there was a Russian criminal conspiracy. What we don't know yet is the role that Americans may have played in that as part of that investigation and that conspiracy. There are plenty of breadcrumbs in the course of this investigation that would lead us to believe that there are people who might be indictable, Americans who might be indictable as part of this. Referenced in that GRU indictment is...
That's the hacking indictment.
The hacking indictment is that there was a presumably Republican congressional campaign that reached out to the Russians masquerading as the hacker known as Guccifer 2.0, that with the aim of trying to get sort of compromising information on that campaign's opponent.
Well, let's go back just to the propaganda indictment. That alleges a conspiracy among Russian entities, and then it says, and others to the grand jury known and unknown. Now,
exactly.
Isn't that a hint that there might be others who were U.S. nationals who were involved in the conspiracy?
Exactly. And there's sort of every reason to believe that Mueller is leaving us breadcrumbs in these indictments about where he's heading next.
And then also they talked about certain individuals who were domestic nationals, Americans, who unwittingly were involved in the conspiracy, and then it kind of left it open with pseudonyms, Doe 1, Doe 2, Doe 3, who might have been American nationals who were witting members of the conspiracy. So I suppose you would say those are some of the breadcrumbs.
Some of the breadcrumbs, certainly. And then remember, this isn't the only area of unfolding legal jeopardy. Sort of separate almost from this entire Russia investigation is the FBI and the Southern District of New York's still unfolding investigation into Michael Cohen and the Trump Organization itself. The only place that the president himself has been named in any of these indictments or court documents is as part of that Michael Cohen guilty plea, where the president was named individual number one as part of the Michael Cohen criminal conspiracy around campaign finance violations. It may have been individual number one as a pseudonym in the indictment, but since the
said candidate for
since it said that he
office,
became since it said that it was a candidate for federal office who became president of the United States in January 2017,
only one
it really
person
narrowed the pool of possible suspects.
Okay, so we have the Michael Cohen indictment. Michael Cohen pleaded guilty. There was no cooperation agreement. But there certainly are reports that Cohen has been cooperating with the special prosecutor. Well, what can he give them?
Well, we don't really know, but we do know that this investigation is substantially larger than just Cohen, that the CFO of the Trump Organization has been granted immunity as part of the investigation.
The accountant, always look for the accountant.
Always follow the money.
Follow the money and look for the accountant.
And that the head of the National Enquirer has actually been granted immunity as part of this investigation as well. So there's every reason to believe.
That's Mr. Robert Pecker.
Exactly. There's every reason to believe that this is still not quite finished in court yet.
Well, there was the allegation in the Steele dossier that Cohen went, I guess, to Prague and gave Russians money to finance the hack. Do you think that's going to be a subject of Cohen's cooperation with the special prosecutor?
There are a lot of moving parts in this. So Paul Manafort has pleaded guilty with a cooperation agreement, and there's sort of every reason to believe, from reading between the lines of Paul Manafort's plea agreement, that he faces a maximum of up to 17 years in federal prison, but under his plea agreement could get as little as 10 years if he provides substantial cooperation to the special counsel's office. And it certainly seems like Paul Manafort thinks that he has information worthy of providing substantial cooperation.
Well, normally a prosecutor doesn't just enter into a cooperation agreement and buy a pig in a poke. There's what lawyers call a proffer, or there's sometimes what's called a queen for a day,
Yep.
where the defendant, who wants to be a cooperating witness, and his lawyer, her lawyer, they come in and make a full disclosure of what it is they would say, and then the prosecutor can see if that's corroborated by other evidence and whether it's reliable. And then they decide whether or not to accept cooperation. Don't you think that happened here?
Almost undoubtedly.
So Mueller must know everything that Manafort could give him.
Yeah, but remember, it's also it's hard for us from the outside to understand this investigation. Mueller has put together this incredibly leak-free investigation, and so we're really struggling in some ways to read the tea leaves. That based on the court documents that we saw last year, all of us, myself included, believed that George Papadopoulos had appeared to provide substantial cooperation to the investigation, and that seemed really important at that moment. But we now know from his sentencing documents that he actually gave Mueller effectively nothing of any real interest whatsoever.
But he did have contact with the Russians during the campaign, and that was a significant piece of evidence.
Yeah, and we don't know that the George Papadopoulos is entirely a dead end. I mean, there's some interesting unanswered questions there. His contacts with Joseph Massoud, some of the other characters involved with this, what he might have said to people inside the campaign at various points is something that we still don't really know the answers to.
Okay, so we have the four areas, the four corners you referred to, and they're pretty much mapped out except for possible domestic involvement. But there are other areas, aren't there, that you can reasonably conclude Mueller is looking at, and maybe you can take us through those.
Yeah, and obviously, in addition to those sort of four areas of the investigation having to do with the 2016 election and the transition and the inauguration, you have the big overarching question, the one that we're sort of all fascinated about nationally, which is obstruction of justice. Did the president or those around him obstruct or attempt to obstruct justice with the firing of Jim Comey, or the pressure that Trump put on Comey to look past the Michael Flynn investigation? That obstruction of justice, that's in some ways the big kahuna on top of all of this. We also know that there are substantial areas of Mueller's investigation that Mueller is quite interested in that haven't really come out publicly. That we know that he's been looking very deeply into questions about Qatar's influence in Washington. That there are
the country Qatar,
the country of Qatar,
yes,
and that sort of what started in some ways as this focus on Russian foreign influence in the U.S. politics is sort of at least one circle larger than that to look at the influence of a variety of countries, including Qatar, on the 2016 election.
Well, and Jared Kushner had a direct relationship with Qatar, didn't he? A business relationship.
Exactly. And this is where you get into some gray areas between the Trump organization, the Kushner organization, and the country of Qatar. There's sort of this weird meeting in the Seychelles with Eric Prince, the founder of the Blackwater mercenary group and brother to Betsy DeVos, the education secretary.
But Prince says it was just about business. Nothing to do with the election.
And we know that Mueller has been quite interested in that meeting for quite some time. I've covered Robert Mueller for more than a decade now, and wrote a book on him when he was FBI director. And I can tell you, Bob Mueller doesn't really do fishing expeditions. That's not in his DNA. And so if Bob Mueller is interested in it, that means it's something that that relates to the core of the questions that he's trying to uncover. And we've seen actually that evidence even in his special counsel's investigation. You know, that Michael Cohen case that we've been talking about with Stormy Daniels and the campaign payments, he handed that off to the Southern District of New York because it wasn't directly tied to his core mission around Russia. We know similarly that he has turned over parts of this foreign influence lobbying investigation that has wrapped up Paul Manafort and the extent to which it has targeted a couple of other heavyweights in DC politics, including Tony Podesta and Greg Craig, former White House counsel for President Obama. He's turned that part of the investigation also over to the Southern District. So in looking at this in sort of a reverse relief format, the fact that Mueller is holding on to parts of this investigation leads us to be able to conclude that it's underlying sort of a foundation that's related to the Russia investigation.
Now, Mueller reports to the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein. The Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, recused himself from anything to do with Russia. And you've called in your article Rod Rosenstein the most interesting figure in the entire piece. Why do you say that?
Well, so Rod Rosenstein, has been was sort of present at the original sin. It was
That's
his
the
memo,
firing of Comey.
Exactly, his memo in his first weeks in office in 2017 was used as the justification by the White House to fire Jim Comey. Rod Rosenstein wrote this memo saying that basically Jim Comey's actions during the 2016 campaign had destroyed the reputation of the FBI, and that the FBI, in order to recover, needed to get rid of Jim Comey.
But then the president, Donald Trump, went on television and he said that he fired Comey because he was looking into Flynn.
Exactly.
So why did he fire Comey?
This is Bob Mueller's central question. Why did he fire Jim Comey?
The statute doesn't say you have to obstruct justice. It says you only have to endeavor to obstruct justice.
Exactly. And that so I think Rod Rosenstein has, ever since that original memo, been trying to rebuild and restore his reputation. That he's not a political tool of the Trump administration. And so, it was his decision to appoint Robert Mueller. Couldn't have asked for sort of a better appointment, someone who's so strongly nonpartisan, apolitical, respected on both sides of the aisle in Washington.
But not by President Trump. He says he's embarked on a witch hunt.
He was respected by the Trump administration, remember, at the beginning of this. Newt Gingrich was out there saying...
the day that he was appointed, he hardly hung up his hat in his office, his white hat, and Trump said it's a witch hunt.
Yeah. And so Rod Rosenstein has been protecting the investigation ever since. And I think that
So is he going to be fired for protecting the investigation?
Well, every day, everyone in America, probably including Rod Rosenstein, wakes up and wonders whether that's the day Rod Rosenstein's going to get fired.
You think it's inevitable that he'll be fired?
Well, what we do know is that we're probably in the final weeks of the status quo of this investigation regardless.
So Rosenstein may be in the death throes.
Because President Trump has been pretty open about his willingness and desire to replace Jeff Sessions following the midterms. And so even if he replaces Jeff Sessions with someone who does not have to recuse himself or herself, Rod Rosenstein might lose control of the Russia investigation, even if Rod stays.
Well, Rosenstein allegedly said he wanted to put a wire in somewhere to eavesdrop on Donald Trump, and he also said that they should consider invoking the 25th Amendment to get rid of Trump. I mean, that's pretty heavy stuff for the Deputy Attorney General or the Attorney General to say. Isn't that a basis for firing him, quite apart from the Mueller investigation?
Well, and we're still very much in the midst of that as an unfolding drama. The president, I think, realized that he was in a difficult position, that firing Rod Rosenstein would be difficult politically. And so that's why you saw him sort of hold on to the Deputy Attorney General during the week of the Kavanaugh hearings, and why he ultimately postponed the in-person meeting with Rod Rosenstein in the midst of the Kavanaugh hearings.
How independent has Rosenstein been of the president in respect of the Mueller investigation? I mean, he did give up documents to a Republican Congress about the investigation. We don't really know what the documents say, but that's kind of unprecedented, isn't it?
It's absolutely unprecedented. And part of what makes that so interesting to me is thinking about, again, sort of the long-term role of Rod Rosenstein in this investigation, which is, I think, the Deputy Attorney General has made the decision that he can lose sort of tactical battles along the way with the House Republicans as long as he thinks he's going to win the war. And that I think he's looking at this as a long-term play to protect Mueller as long as possible.
So what will Mueller's end product be? Do you think it's going to be a report to the House of Representatives in support of a bill of impeachment, or do you think it's going to be an indictment? Where do you think he's going?
Yeah, and I think the answer is we just don't know. What I do think, though, is that people shouldn't miss that Bob Mueller is in some ways writing the Mueller report in public every couple of weeks. That the sum total of his indictments and plea agreements, his criminal complaints, his criminal information, all of his court filings are deeper, broader, and more detailed than what they need to be. And you know from your days as a lawyer that saying more in court documents than you absolutely need to is actually rare. That you sort of want to boil your court documents.
Perhaps not in a case like this involving the president.
Well, and I think exactly that, which is Mueller is cramming a lot of what I would describe as sort of extra information into these indictments.
We call them evidentiary facts.
Exactly. These are sort of what they call speaking indictments.
So you look at the hacking indictment. I mean, it's just extraordinary, the detail that they have and what happened in Moscow at certain times and certain dates, and the searches that were conducted before Guccifer was launched. I mean, where did he get all that information?
Well, and this is one, some of these documents are hinting at human source intelligence or signals intelligence information, unlike anything that we have ever seen in public documents from the U.S. government. I mean, this is incredibly detailed levels of intelligence production that are making their way into the public view and the public domain through these court documents in ways that is really unprecedented. And again, if you're reading these indictments carefully, there's so much fascinating stuff buried in the individual sentences of this. In the Twitter bots and trolls indictment of the Internet Research Agency, he talks about some of these analysts from the IRA coming over to travel through the United States. He names almost all of them, except for one traveler who goes to Atlanta and to Georgia in the run-up to the 2016 election.
State of Georgia.
The state of Georgia, to sort of do some on-the-ground research. But Mueller knows so much about that individual that he knows who that individual filed his or her expense reports with when they got back to the Internet Research Agency.
Okay, now what about Roger Stone, Trump consultant, who the only person alive that we know of that had contact both with Guccifer and WikiLeaks? Is he likely to be indicted?
I think, on almost any given week right now, we could see a Roger Stone indictment.
Okay, so I have a question for you, Garrett Graff. Does Mueller have a good case against Donald Trump?
We don't know. And I think in some ways that's the most interesting part of this, is that we're sort of looking at the Mueller investigation really with an eye towards this question of obstruction of justice, whereas Mueller might be conducting this incredibly detailed counterintelligence investigation on Russia's role in the 2016 election. Because remember, and this gets lost in all of the president's attacks on Comey and Andy McCabe, the deputy director, Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, all of these other career FBI and Justice Department officials. The FBI originally launched its investigation in 2016 as a way to protect the Trump campaign, that it saw concerning attempts at contact from Russian officials, and it stepped in as a counterintelligence matter to try to protect the Trump campaign from people who were coming at the campaign with ulterior motives.
Okay, a counterintelligence investigation to protect the Trump campaign. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. This has been just marvelous. But Garrett Graff, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.